Hi everyone! Today's writing tutorial is going to be covering basic comma rules. All the sample sentences in this video use the very familiar and much loved text, The Outsiders. The first comma rule that we're going to be looking at is using a comma after you introduce a quote. A quote is a sentence that's written in quotation marks. This could be dialogue that a character says, and more often it's going to be text evidence that you are pulling verbatim from the text and putting in quotes. Two examples here. Cherry told Ponyboy, quote, "Things are rough all over." You're going to notice that the comma comes before the quotation mark and comes before the quote itself. I'm sure a lot of you are used to writing in the text it states, comma, "Let's do it for Johnny." Okay, so anytime you want to write a quote down, you must put a comma beforehand. You're going to notice that there is a common phrase, punctuation before quotation. You're going to want to put a punctuation mark, be it a comma, before any quotation. And you're also going to notice here that there's punctuation before this quotation mark too, because your punctuation goes before your quotation. Again, this is a comma rule, but still it applies to any sort of punctuation before quotation. The next rule is using a comma between two adjectives. You have to identify that an adjective is a word that describes a noun. If there are two adjectives next to each other, you must put a comma between them to separate the two ideas. Ponyboy was wearing his old sleeveless sweatshirt. Old and sleeveless being the adjectives, sweatshirt being the noun. You must separate those two adjectives with a comma. Johnny lived in an old, run-down house with his parents. Old and run-down being the adjective to describe the house, a comma being used to separate them. The next comma rule is using a comma after most transition words. Most of you have used transition words in your writing on a regular basis. Some examples are therefore, however, as a result, in addition, at first, to begin, first of all, etc., etc. Whenever you use a transition word, you are going to want to have a comma after it. It separates the transition from the thought. In addition, comma, Ponyboy and Johnny cut their hair to disguise themselves. At first, Pony didn't believe that it was Johnny who killed the Soch. You're going to want to use two commas when a sentence is interrupted with additional information. This is really easy to identify because if you have a sentence that could be read without the interruption and it would still make sense, then that's how you know it's an interruption. If you look at here, Steve Randall, Soda's best friend, did not really like Ponyboy. If I take out this interruption here, Soda's best friend, and read the sentence, Steve Randall did not really like Ponyboy, it still makes sense. So when a sentence is interrupted with additional information, which would be Soda's best friend, that's where you have to use two commas, okay? Down here it's the same thing. Ponyboy, even though he never remembered, had a nightmare after his parents were killed. If I take out this interruption, even though he never remembered, the sentence should still make sense. Ponyboy had a nightmare after his parents were killed. So again, you're going to want to use two commas to separate that additional information that's interrupting the original sentence. You're going to want to do the same thing in your own writing. When you see two complete sentences that use a conjunction, and, but, or, nor, for, so, but, or, yet, two separate sentences that use one of those conjunctions, you're going to want to use a comma before the conjunction. So in this example here, the first sentence, I've got two sentences. Ponyboy and Two-Bit had to leave Johnny's room. They went to visit Dally instead. I combine those two thoughts by using a conjunction, and the conjunction so, and I want to make sure that I put a comma before that. Ponyboy and Two-Bit had to leave Johnny's room, so they went to visit Dally instead. Two separate sentences using that conjunction. The second example uses the conjunction example of but. We've got two sentences. Johnny knew the gang was worried about him. He really wanted to know if his parents were worried. Okay, so if we use a conjunction with that comma, it says Johnny knew the gang was worried about him, but he really wanted to know if his parents were worried. That's a way to combine your sentences to make them sound less choppy and a little more sophisticated. Using commas when listing in a series is probably the easiest and most common use of commas that you're going to see. They're easy to identify and definitely something that you should have mastered already. This is just review. Dally gave Ponyboy a dry shirt, money, directions, and a gun. Listing out 4 things: dry shirt, money, directions, and a gun. You're going to separate those 4 things with commas. Derry wanted Ponyboy to get good grades, play football, and use his head. We've got getting good grades, playing football, and using his head. Those listed items that Derry wanted are separated with a comma. Last, you're going to use a comma to introduce an introductory phrase if it's more than 3 words. The way you identify an introductory phrase is if you took that part off at the beginning of a sentence. If the rest of the sentence makes sense on its own, then you know it's an introductory phrase. Toward the end of the story, Ponyboy realizes something about life and how people interact. We can tell that it's an introductory phrase because if I take out toward the end of the story, which is introducing when it happened, I'm left with Ponyboy realizes something about life and how people interact. I want to make sure to separate that introductory phrase, much like a transition word, but it's a phrase. We want to separate that with a comma. Okay, the second example, before the movie even started, Dally was harassing Cherry. I've got the sentence, Dally was harassing Cherry, but I added that additional information with a comma so that your reader could know when exactly it's happening, before the movie even started. Okay? As a result of the report, you can go on and finish that statement any way you want. This was your basic comma rule tutorial. Happy writing.